So this is Econ Lab 11. The first question asks, what is a price level? A price level is the average price for all goods, which when increased is called inflation. And if the price level is higher in one country than the other, that usually means the standard of living is generally lower in that country. So question 2 asks, what are some forces that could cause shocks to V, the velocity of money? And these include inflation, interest rates, and real GDP, as shown by the formula below. Question 3 asks, what is probably a bigger problem, a steady rate of inflation of 15% or a rate of inflation that varies unexpectedly from 0% to 15%, so on average the rate is below 15%. So the inflation that varies unexpectedly year to year would be a bigger problem because if people know the rate of inflation, they can plan for it. However, when people expect inflation to be lower than it is, they could mistake it for increased prices or demand and make costly economic mistakes, which they could also make if they expect inflation to be higher than it is. So question 4 asks, who gets helped by surprise inflation? People who owe money or people who lend money? So the people who owe money definitely benefit because the amount they owe is now worth less, so that it's easier to pay off.
Question 5. Yeah, so people with mortgages would lobby for government for fast money growth because when there's a fast money growth, there's an inflation, and inflation usually helps people who owe money to other people, and people with mortgages owe money to the bank, therefore it'll help them and they'll lobby for the government more. Question 6. So a higher inflation would discourage people from saving. This is because savers have to pay taxes based on the nominal interest rate, so the interest rate would be higher for them, and they would be losing money as a result of doing that. In order for the government to raise a higher tax revenue in short run, it should push higher inflation rate because this would increase the taxes for people. Therefore, the government would make more money. Question 7. The real interest rate indicates how many goods and services one can buy in the future because it accounts for the inflation rate of the market. And in the media, usually the nominal interest rate is talked about because nominal interest rate uh, it doesn't really account for inflation. That's what they talk about in the media. Question 8. Um, the Fisher effect states that nominal interest rate is the sum of real interest rate plus the inflation. Therefore, if everyone expects the inflation rate to go up by 10%, the biggest effect would be on the nominal interest rate because that would be added to the real interest rate. Question 9. The inflation rate is calculated by the future price value minus the current price value divided by 100 times 100%. And if you just put in the numbers, you get 10%, 20%, and 1% for each of them.
So with question number 10, we're required to use the equation of exchange to solve for P. So price, or P, is 15 in the first one, 20 in the second one, and 10 in the third one, with using this table. With question number 11, if the money supply doubles, then the price level will also double, but the real GDP will remain the same, which means that the price level increases by 100% and the real GDP increases by nothing. With question number 12, the first one, based on the headline, that's a decrease in M. The second one is an increase in V or velocity. The third is an increase in price. The fourth, with workers, is an increase in yield. The fifth is also an increase in yield, and the last one is a decrease in velocity. With 13, inflation is the cruelest tax, and it mostly affects physical money holders who don't gain any interest on the money that they hold. So this is people who physically hold their currency, businesses that physically hold their currency, and people or businesses that have their money deposited in a way that doesn't give them any interest, that's above the inflation rate. Question 14. In both situations, they leave the immediate recipient richer, but then eventually devalue the current currency, and they also increase the money supply. They're very similar. The biggest difference is that counterfeiting isn't legal or allowed by the government and is not necessarily always for the common good.
So let's do question 15. Using the Fisher effect, fill in the empty values in the table. What is the Fisher effect? The Fisher effect is an equation that defines that shows the relationship between the nominal interest rate I, the expected inflation rate E pi, and equilibrium rate of return. And it says that the nominal interest rate is equal to the expected inflation rate plus equilibrium rate of return. So we can see from this table that we can predict unknown variables if we are provided with two of the values. So we can see that if we're provided with the nominal interest rate and the expected inflation rate, we can solve for our equilibrium. And we can see that as nominal interest rates rise, the expected inflation rate will also rise. We can make this equation more complicated by inserting and deriving other formulas, such as solving for expected inflation rate or solving for nominal interest rate. Question number 16. So we first have to look at what the Consumer Price Index actually is. And Consumer Price Index is essentially an average price on goods in a certain year. So we can see that in 1990, this average price, based off the graph to the right, was 130.658. We can see that in 2010, the average price was 218.076. Now, how do we find a total inflation rate based off these two values? You see, what we do is we take the difference between the two consumer price indexes and then divide this value by the initial consumer price value and then multiply this entire value by 100 to gain a percentage. We can see that our total inflation rate will equal 66.9%. Question 17. So when an expected inflation rate, the column to the left, is lower than the actual inflation rate, banks will hurt the most. When the expected inflation rate is higher than the real inflation rate, then homeowners will hurt the most. And why is this? Essentially, if homeowners are believing that interest rates are going to be high, and when in reality inflation rates are low, they are buying mortgage bonds at higher prices than they need to be. They're essentially buying them at a higher price than they could be. And the inverse is also true. When banks are selling mortgage bonds, when accounting for low inflation rates, they're essentially losing a bunch of money that they could be if they adjusted their prices for an increase in inflation rates. So we can see that in case A, banks would hurt the most. In case B, homeowners would be hurting the most. In case C and D, banks would again be hurting the most. And in case E, neither party would be hurting more than the other, since essentially both parties had accounted perfectly for the inflation rate. So essentially both parties are breaking even. Case C might look confusing. However, banks in this scenario would be accounting for a negative inflation rate, when in reality it would be 0%. So even then, banks would be essentially this inflation from a perceived deflation would affect banks negatively. Question 18. So we can see these values of the nominal interest rate I here on the left, inflation with no surprises. This is where our expected inflation equals our actual inflation right here. And we can use these two values to calculate nominal after-tax return and real after-tax return. And the idea is that as inflation increases, as the inflation rate increases, the real after-tax return will dramatically decrease, while it seems that the nominal after-tax return will increase. The nominal after-tax will increase, making it seem that the economy is doing good. However, in reality, the real after-tax return will dramatically decrease. So let's see if this works. So we can see that this idea holds water. So as it increases from 9% inflation to 897% inflation, we can see that the real after-tax return will decrease from -1% all the way to -297%. And what does this mean? So this means, like the book said, that inflation has a dramatically illusionary effect on the entire economy. Essentially, consumers and buyers would essentially be thinking that they're making positive nominal after-tax returns, when in reality, they are getting negative after-tax returns. Essentially, this inflation rate is disguising what is actually happening. So although nominal interest rates are increasing and it seems that after-tax returns are increasing, we're having positive growth, then in reality, there's actually negative growth, and it's pretty substantial negative growth as well. So this proves the illusionary effects of inflation, and it proves how inflation can also be difficult to climb out of, since a negative 297% after-tax return is very difficult to overcome. So I hope these answers are suitable, and I look forward to seeing you guys again. Thank you.